My husband of 10 years left me for a younger woman, calling my life small and predictable. So I let him go, knowing he was about to find out his predictable wife owned the company that was about to fire him. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The words fell into the quiet Saturday air of our sun-drenched kitchen, as out of place as stones tossed into a perfectly still pond. I was at the counter, carefully repotting an orchid, my fingers deep in fresh, dark soil. It was my weekend ritual, a small, meditative act that grounded me. The scent of earth and the delicate structure of the roots were a comfort, a predictable joy in a life I had carefully cultivated. "Linda," Greg began, his voice strained with an unfamiliar, rehearsed formality. "We need to talk." I didn't look up immediately. I gently settled the orchid into its new ceramic home, tamping the soil around its base. "We are talking, Greg. What is it?" My tone was calm, perhaps too calm. In the periphery, I could see him shifting his weight from foot to foot, a nervous habit he developed whenever he was about to ask for a big favor or deliver bad news he knew I wouldn't like. He cleared his throat. "I'm leaving you." My hands stilled. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of a bird outside the window. I slowly lifted my head to look at him. He stood by the doorway, dressed in a new, sharply tailored jacket I'd never seen before. He looked like a man about to give a presentation, not one who was dismantling a decade of marriage. His face, which I knew as well as my own, was a mask of strained sincerity. "I see," I said. The words felt small and inadequate, but they were the only ones I could find. He seemed to take my quiet response as an invitation to elaborate, to justify the bomb he had just detonated in our shared life. "It's just, I need more, Linda. I need a life that's vibrant and exciting. I'm tired of this." He gestured vaguely around the kitchen, at the comfortable, lived-in space we had built together. "This small, predictable life. I need someone who understands that, who wants that with me." A small, predictable life. The phrase echoed in the space between us. He was talking about my life, the life I had poured myself into, the one that had been designed, piece by piece, to create a stable, peaceful foundation from which he could launch himself into the world each day. The life that included tending to our home, managing our finances with quiet efficiency, hosting the endless dinners for his colleagues, and editing the manuscripts that brought me personal fulfillment but no public glory. He saw it all not as a source of strength and support, but as a cage. "There's someone else," he continued, his gaze finally dropping to the floor. "Her name is Tiffany. She's full of life. We're in love." Of course there was. A younger woman, no doubt. Someone from his office, I presumed, who saw the senior vice president of operations at Innovate Logistics and was dazzled by the title, the suit, and the air of authority he projected within those corporate walls. She saw the finished product, not the man I had supported through night classes for his MBA, the man I had coached through his anxieties before every major promotion. I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me. The initial shock was there, a deep, seismic tremor in my soul, but it was being rapidly overtaken by something else. A quiet, simmering resolve. He looked at me, expecting tears, pleading a dramatic scene. He had braced himself for a fight. He had no idea he wasn't going to get one. I pulled my gardening gloves off, finger by finger, and set them on the counter. I walked to the sink, washed the soil from my hands, and dried them carefully on a towel. Every movement was deliberate. I was buying time, not to process the hurt, but to cement the plan that was already forming in my mind with startling precision. I turned back to him. His expression was a mixture of impatience and confusion. "All right, Greg," I said, my voice even. "If that's your decision, I won't stand in your way." He blinked, clearly taken aback. "That's it, all right." "What else is there to say?" I asked, meeting his gaze directly. "You've made up your mind. I would like you to pack a bag and be gone by the end of the day. We can arrange for you to get the rest of your things later." His jaw worked silently for a moment. This was not the script he had imagined. The powerful man who had just delivered a life-altering decree was suddenly off balance, his grand, dramatic exit turning into a simple, unceremonious dismissal. He saw my composure and mistook it for weakness, for the final proof of the boring woman he was. So eager to leave behind, he couldn't see the steel beneath the surface. He couldn't know that his betrayal was not just an emotional wound, but a colossal strategic error. The betrayal was worse than any pain I could have imagined, but the ignorance of it was his true downfall. Greg stood frozen for a moment longer, his carefully prepared speech rendered useless. My placid acceptance had disarmed him more effectively than any screaming match could have. He seemed to shrink a little, the puffed-up importance draining out of him, replaced by a flicker of bewilderment. "By the end of the day," he stammered, as if the concept were foreign, "Linda, be reasonable. I have things here. We have a life here." "You just said you didn't want this life, Greg," I reminded him gently, my voice devoid of the sharp edge of anger he was likely expecting. "You said you needed something vibrant and exciting. This house, this life, is the opposite of that, remember? So it shouldn't be a hardship to leave it behind. Pack what you need for the immediate future. I'm sure Tiffany will have space for you." The mention of her name seemed to jolt him back into his role. He straightened his new jacket and put the mask of condescension back on. "Fine," he said, his tone clipped. "If that's how you want to be, cold, I should have expected it." He turned on his heel and strode toward our bedroom, the sound of his expensive shoes echoing on the hardwood floors. I remained in the kitchen, listening to the muffled sounds of drawers opening and closing, the rustle of clothes being hastily thrown into a suitcase. I did not follow him. I did not offer to help. I simply went back to my orchid, giving it a small drink of water from a delicate can, my hands perfectly steady. Each drop of water felt like a punctuation mark at the end of a long, convoluted sentence. An hour later, he emerged, pulling a sleek carry-on suitcase behind him. His jaw was tight, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and self-righteousness. He was a man convinced of his own victimhood, even as he was the one holding the axe. He stopped in the entryway, refusing to look at me directly, instead focusing on a point somewhere over my shoulder. "I'll have my assistant coordinate with you about the rest of my things, and my lawyer will be in touch about the arrangements." "There's no need," I said calmly. "I'll have everything boxed up for you. Just tell me where to send it. As for lawyers, I'll be in touch with mine on Monday morning. I'm sure they can handle everything efficiently." My efficiency, once a quality he praised as essential to his success, was now clearly unnerving him. He wanted a messy, emotional battle. A war would have validated his decision, proving that what he was leaving behind had passion, that it was worth fighting over. My calm, logistical approach offered him no such validation. It was like closing a business account. "Right," he said, his voice flat. He fumbled for his keys on the small table by the door, his movements clumsy. He couldn't seem to get out of the house fast enough. As his hand closed over the keys, I felt a single, final question rise to my lips. It wasn't born of a desire to reconcile, but of a need to understand the depth of his delusion. 10 years, Greg. Was any of it real? He finally looked at me then, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not guilt, but a sort of weary pity. It was the most insulting expression I had ever seen. "It was real for a time, Linda," he said, his voice softening into the patronizing tone a parent might use with a child. "But people change. I've grown. I've become someone who needs more. You've stayed the same. Comfortable. It's not your fault." He thought he was being kind, offering me a gentle excuse for my supposed inadequacy. He truly believed he had outgrown me. He saw the woman who edited dusty manuscripts and tended to her garden, and he could not fathom the world that existed beyond his limited perception. He saw the quiet surface and never once bothered to look at the depths beneath. He had built his entire career at Innovate Logistics, rising through the ranks with ambition and drive, yet he had no idea who held the true power in that organization. He had no idea that the small, predictable life, he was so disdainfully casting aside was the very foundation upon which his vibrant, exciting career had been built. He opened the door, the bright afternoon sun flooding the entryway. "Goodbye, Linda." "Goodbye, Greg," I replied, my voice steady. He walked out without a backward glance, pulling the door shut behind him. The click of the latch was deafening in the sudden, absolute silence of the house. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of his car starting, the engine revving, and then the slow crunch of tires on the gravel driveway as he pulled away, driving out of my life. The pain was a sharp physical thing, a hollow ache in my chest, but as I stood alone in my quiet, orderly home, the feeling was already being replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He believed he was taking everything of value with him. He thought he was leaving a relic of his past for a brighter future. But he had forgotten one crucial thing. The days that followed Greg's departure were filled with a strange and hollow quiet. The house, usually humming with the low-grade energy of two lives lived in parallel, was now still. I found myself noticing the absence of his things before I noticed the absence of him. The space on the bathroom counter where his electric razor used to be, the empty hook in the entryway where he always hung his coat, the silence in the evenings where the blare of his sports channel used to be. I let myself feel the grief. It was a necessary part of the process. I had loved him, or at least, I had loved the man I believed him to be for a decade. I had dedicated a significant portion of my life to the project of our marriage. I had been his sounding board, his strategist, his social secretary, and his unwavering cheerleader. When Innovate Logistics was just a fledgling company my father, Arthur, was trying to get off the ground, Greg was a junior analyst, full of raw ambition but lacking polish. I was the one who helped him rewrite his reports, who coached him on his presentation skills, who hosted countless dinners for potential clients and key executives. I made our home a warm, welcoming hub that made Greg look stable, successful, and well-supported, all qualities my father's old guard colleagues valued. I remembered one evening, years ago. Greg was up for his first major promotion to a director role. He was terrified, convinced he was going to be passed over for someone with a more impressive pedigree. We stayed up until 2 a.m. in the kitchen, a bottle of wine between us, as I helped him reframe his entire strategy for the final interview. I pointed out his weaknesses and gave him concrete ways to address them. I bolstered his confidence, reminding him of his strengths. He got the promotion. That night, he'd held me close and whispered, "I couldn't do any of this without you, Linda. You're my secret weapon." Over the years, the secret weapon had become a small, predictable life. My support had become so seamless, so integrated into the fabric of his success, that he had ceased to see it at all. He saw only his own ascent, his own brilliance. And then there was Tiffany. I had met her only once, at the company's annual holiday party last December. She had been attached to Greg's side for most of the evening, ostensibly as a junior member of his operations team. She was exactly as I had pictured, young, with bright, hungry eyes and a smile that was all teeth. She wore a dress that was just a little too daring for a corporate event, and she laughed just a little too loudly at all of Greg's jokes. I remembered watching her, a vague sense of unease settling over me even then. It wasn't just her obvious admiration for my husband. It was the way she looked around the room, the way her eyes scanned the senior partners and board members, cataloging them. It was the way she'd looked at me when Greg introduced us. "So you're the famous Linda," she'd said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "Greg talks about you all the time. He says you're the one who keeps everything running perfectly at home so he can focus on the big picture at work." On the surface, it was a compliment, but underneath, the implication was clear. I was the domestic support staff. She, on the other hand, was part of the big picture. Her interest in our life felt less like polite conversation and more like an appraisal. She asked pointed questions about our house, our vacations, the car Greg drove. At the time, I dismissed it as the gaucheness of youth, a bit of awkward social climbing. Now I saw it for what it was, reconnaissance. She was assessing the assets, sizing up the position she intended to usurp. Greg had been completely blinded by her fawning attention. He was a man whose ego had grown in lockstep with his job title, and Tiffany was an expert at stroking that ego. She made him feel like the titan of industry he so desperately wanted to be. In her eyes, he wasn't just a senior VP, he was a king. And I, in contrast, had become the comfortable old throne he no longer found impressive. The ultimate irony, the one that made me want to laugh even through the pain, was that Tiffany had hitched her wagon to the wrong horse. She saw Greg as the source of power at Innovate Logistics. She had no idea he was merely a high-level employee. She couldn't possibly know that the quiet, predictable woman she had dismissed at a Christmas party held the entire company in the palm of her hand. They had both made the same critical error in judgment. They had looked at me and seen a gardener, a book editor, a wife. They had failed to see the owner. That realization was the turning point. The grief began to recede, replaced by a cold, clarifying anger. My love had been betrayed, my loyalty had been trampled, and my life's work had been mocked. They thought I was a footnote in Greg's story. It was time to remind them who was writing the book. The fog of shock and sorrow began to lift by Monday morning, replaced by the sharp, clean lines of purpose. I made myself a pot of strong coffee, sat down at the antique writing desk in my study, a piece I'd inherited from my grandmother, and made 2 phone calls. The first was to my father, Arthur. He was retired, living comfortably in a seaside town a few hours away, but his mind was as sharp as ever. I told him everything, my voice calm and measured as I recounted Greg's speech and his departure. Arthur was silent on the other end of the line for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was gravelly with controlled fury. "The ungrateful fool," he said, the words a low rumble. "After everything, after all you've done." There was a pause. "Linda, the trust your shares, he still doesn't know." "He knows nothing, Dad," I confirmed. "He left on Saturday thinking he was leaving a bored housewife, not the majority shareholder of his company." I could almost hear the slow, grim smile forming on his face. "Good," he said simply. "That was always the point of it. Your security, your independence, it was never for him. What do you want to do?" The question hung in the air. What did I want? Revenge? To see him ruined? Perhaps, but it was more than that. This wasn't just about a cheating husband. It was about protecting my father's legacy. Innovate Logistics was the company he had built from the ground up, a testament to his integrity and hard work. Greg's behavior, his entitlement, was a stain on that legacy. "I want to handle it," I said, a newfound strength solidifying in my voice. "I need to handle it, my way." "Then you know who to call," Arthur said, his trust in me absolute. "He's been waiting for this day since I signed the papers." My second call was to that person. David Chen, the family's lawyer and the trustee of the holding company that contained my 51% stake in Innovate Logistics. David was a quiet, meticulous man in his 60s who had worked with my father for 40 years. He viewed the company less as a corporate entity and more as a family heirloom to be protected at all costs. "Linda," he said, his voice warm but immediately professional, "I was sorry to hear from your father. Are you all right?" "I will be, David," I said, "but I need your help. It's time to activate my position." A different kind of silence came from David's end, the sound of a strategist shifting gears. "I see," he said. "I have the documents ready. They have been ready for 5 years. What is your first move?" This was my clever trap, the ultimate piece of leverage. It wasn't some convoluted scheme. It was simple, irrefutable ownership. My father, a shrewd judge of character, had suspected Greg's ambition might one day curdle into arrogance. When he retired, he didn't just pass the shares to me. He placed them in an ironclad, discretionary trust, managed by David, with me as the sole beneficiary. The shares were legally and financially insulated from my marriage. They were mine and mine alone. Greg had no idea the trust even existed. "Greg feels he has outgrown his small, predictable life with me," I explained to David. "He is having an affair with a junior employee, a Tiffany something or other from marketing. I suspect he's become careless." Arrogant men often do. I want you to discreetly pull all of Greg's expense reports and corporate credit card statements for the past year. I can do that, David confirmed. The bylaws give the trustee full audit authority over executive expenditures. What am I looking for? Anything that blurs the line between professional and personal, I said. Specifically, anything involving Tiffany. Dinners, travel, hotels, gifts. He's a senior VP. He has a generous expense account. I want to see how he's been using it. Consider it done, David said. I'll have a full report for you within 48 hours. What happens then? Then, I said, looking out my study window at the garden I had so lovingly tended, we call a board meeting. Hanging up the phone, I felt a profound shift within me. The hurt was still there, a tender bruise on my heart, but it was no longer the dominant emotion. I was no longer the victim of Greg's narrative. I was the author of my own. He had made the colossal mistake of thinking my quiet life was a simple one. He had no idea that my days spent editing manuscripts had honed my attention to detail, my ability to spot inconsistencies in a narrative. He had no idea that my years of managing our complex household finances had made me more fiscally astute than he could imagine. He thought he was the shark, the titan of the corporate world. He was about to find out E was a goldfish swimming in my bowl. The investigation had begun. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for the evidence that would allow me to spring it. The next 48 hours passed in a state of suspended animation. I moved through my days with a sense of calm purpose, editing a dense historical novel with one part of my brain while the other waited for David's call. I boxed up Greg's remaining possessions, each item a small ghost of our shared past. The golf clubs he only used at corporate retreats, the collection of pretentious business biographies he displayed but never read, the expensive watch I'd given him for our 5th anniversary. I packed it all away with a dispassionate efficiency that surprised even me. It was no longer my life, it was an archive of a former one. The call came on Wednesday afternoon. "Linda, it's David," he said, his voice tight with a lawyer's restrained satisfaction. "It's worse than we thought." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Tell me." "He's been extraordinarily brazen," David began. "I have a year's worth of statements from his corporate American Express card. It's a laundry list. Dinners at the city's most expensive restaurants, always for two, coded as client entertainment. Weekend trips to Napa Valley, flights and 5-star hotels, listed as market research. There's a monthly charge for a luxury car service, not to his usual routes, but to an apartment building in a trendy downtown neighborhood. An apartment, I have discovered, that is leased in the name of one Tiffany Miller." My breath hitched. It was so much more blatant than I had imagined. "And the final piece, Linda," David continued, his voice grim. 3 months ago, he approved a discretionary marketing bonus of $20,000 for Ms. Miller. The justification was for her outstanding contributions on the Q2 logistics project. I cross-referenced with HR. Her manager knew nothing about it. Greg pushed it through using his senior executive authority. He hadn't just been having an affair. He had been funding it with company money. My father's money. My money. He had been stealing from me to build a new life, all while calling my own life small and insufficient. "That's it," I said, my voice as cold as ice. "That's everything we need." "What are your instructions?" David asked. "Cancel his access," I said without hesitation. "Keycard, corporate accounts, email, everything. Effective immediately. Then, I want you to draft a notice for an emergency meeting of the board of directors for Friday morning. The agenda item will be a review of executive conduct." "And Greg." "He'll find out when his key doesn't work," I said. "Let him panic." The first confrontation was not face-to-face. It happened, as I'd planned, via my phone. It was just after 9 a.m. on Thursday morning. I was in my garden, pruning roses, when my phone buzzed with a call from a number I knew by heart. I let it ring 3 times before answering, taking a deep, calming breath. "Hello." "Linda, what is going on?" Greg's voice was a frantic, furious bark in my ear. My keycard was just declined at the office. Security looked at me like I was a criminal. My corporate Amex was just rejected trying to buy a coffee. They're saying my accounts are frozen. Did you do this? Is this some kind of petty revenge? I continued to snip a dead bloom from a rose bush, my movements unhurried. I have no idea what you're talking about, Greg, I said, my voice a portrait of mild confusion. Why would I have anything to do with your keycard at Innovate Logistics? Don't play dumb with me, he roared, his professional veneer completely shattered. This is because I left, isn't it? You're trying to ruin me. I'm calling HR, I'm calling the CEO. I'll have this sorted out in 5 minutes and you will regret this. You should do that, I said, my tone still placid. I imagine there's a reason for all of this. Perhaps you should check with them. It sounds like a serious internal matter. His blustering faltered, a note of genuine fear creeping into his voice. My refusal to engage, to fight with him, was clearly throwing him. He couldn't land a punch if I wouldn't even stand in the ring. What do you know about this, Linda? He demanded, his voice dropping to a suspicious hiss. I only know what you told me, Greg, I said, and for the first time I let a sliver of ice enter my tone. You were moving on to a bigger, more exciting life. I'm just here, living my small, predictable one. I have manuscripts to edit. I'm sure you and your vibrant new partner will figure it all out. Goodbye. I ended the call before he could respond. I switched my phone to silent and placed it on the small garden table beside me. The silence that followed was beautiful. It was the sound of the first domino falling. He was locked out. He was cut off. The power he thought he had was an illusion, and the curtain was being pulled back for the very first time. He was flailing, trying to call upon an authority he no longer possessed. His threats were empty, his anger impotent. This was the first reveal, not of my power, but of his powerlessness. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was only the beginning of his confusion. The real shock was yet to come. Greg's panic, which I had only heard over the phone, quickly escalated into a full-blown corporate meltdown. I learned later, through a discreet update from David, that Greg had spent the rest of Thursday in a desperate frenzy. He had tried to storm past security, only to be politely but firmly escorted out of the Innovate Logistics building. He had bombarded the interim CEO, Frank Morrison, with furious calls and texts, all of which went unanswered on David's instruction. He had even tried to contact a few board members he considered his allies, only to be met with polite, non-committal responses. The walls were closing in, and he had no idea who was building them. Meanwhile, David and I were finalizing our strategy. He had compiled the evidence into a clear, concise, and damning portfolio, highlighted credit card statements, flight itineraries, hotel receipts, and the signed authorization for Tiffany's fraudulent bonus. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. It was a methodical, irrefutable case of embezzlement and gross misconduct. They will have no choice but to terminate him for cause, David stated over the phone on Thursday evening. This will mean no severance, no stock options vesting, nothing. It's a clean cut. And Tiffany Miller, I asked. Her involvement in conspiring to defraud the company makes her complicit. Her termination will be recommended on the same grounds, David confirmed. There was a part of me, a small, lingering echo of the woman I had been, that felt a sliver of pity. Their lives were about to be systematically dismantled. But then I remembered Greg's condescending words, the pity in his eyes as he'd left me. I remembered the cold calculation in Tiffany's gaze at that holiday party. They had made their choices. They had gambled, thinking I was a worthless hand. They deserved to lose. The final piece of the plan was the board meeting itself. David had sent the official notice to all 7 members, including Greg. Summonsing him to the meeting was a critical part of the strategy. It would prevent him from claiming he was fired without due process. More importantly, it would ensure he was present for his own downfall. He would walk into that room expecting a fight, a chance to defend himself and rally support. He would be walking into an execution. On Friday morning, I chose my outfit with the care of a general preparing for battle. I didn't choose a power suit or anything overtly corporate. I wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress, a string of my mother's pearls, and low heels. I wanted to look exactly like myself, calm, composed, and utterly resolute. I wanted to be the woman Greg had underestimated in the flesh. I arrived at the Innovate Logistics Tower an hour before the meeting. I didn't go up to the executive floor. Instead, I went to a small, private office that David had reserved for me, one floor below. My father, Arthur, was waiting for me there, having driven in that morning. He stood up as I entered, his face etched with concern. He enveloped me in a hug that felt like coming home. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, holding me at arm's length. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "I am. Thank you for being here, Dad." "I wouldn't be anywhere else," he said, his eyes fierce. "This is your company as much as it was ever mine. You are doing the right thing. You are protecting our family's work." We sat together for a while, not speaking much. His presence was a silent, powerful anchor. He wasn't there to fight my battle for me, but to bear witness, to lend me his strength. 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, David came into the office. He gave me a crisp, reassuring nod. "Everyone is assembled," he said. "Greg is there. Frank tells me he looks furious, but he's trying to project confidence. He's been telling anyone who will listen that this is a result of a hostile personal attack from his unstable, estranged wife." I felt a flash of hot anger at the lie, but I pushed it down. It didn't matter. The truth was about to have its moment. "It's time," I said, standing up. My father stood as well. "I'll be watching via the conference link from here," he said, squeezing my hand. "Go on now, show them who you are." I walked with David to the private elevator that connected to the executive boardroom. As we ascended, I felt a strange sense of peace. The fear was gone. The hurt was a distant echo. All that remained was a cold, clear focus. Greg was still struggling with his loyalty to his own ego, trying to paint me as the villain. He was about to be confronted with a truth so absolute, so undeniable that it would shatter his entire perception of reality. The case was built. The jury was assembled. The final, powerful confrontation was about to begin. The boardroom was exactly as I remembered it from the handful of holiday events I'd attended over the years. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the morning light pouring in from the floor-to-ceiling windows, which offered a panoramic view of the city. The air was thick with tension. The 6 board members were seated, along with the interim CEO, Frank Morrison. And at the far end of the table, looking wildly out of place in his self-imposed isolation, was Greg. He was dressed in his finest suit, the picture of corporate power, but the facade was cracking. His face was pale, his knuckles white where he gripped a leather portfolio. When David and I entered, every head turned. Greg's eyes locked onto me, and his expression morphed from tense confidence into pure, unadulterated fury. He visibly started to rise from his seat, his mouth opening to speak. Frank Morrison cut him off before he could begin. "Greg, please, let's allow the meeting to come to order." David and I took 2 empty seats opposite Greg. I placed my simple handbag on the table and folded my hands calmly on top of it. I met Greg's glare with a serene, unblinking gaze. "This is an outrage, Frank," Greg burst out, unable to contain himself. "What is she doing here? This is a private board meeting, not a divorce court. Her presence here is completely inappropriate. This is a personal vendetta that has spilled into my professional life." Frank, a stoic man in his late 60s who had been my father's most trusted colleague, looked not at Greg, but at David. "Mr. Chen, the floor is yours." David stood. "Thank you, Frank. Members of the board. We are here today to address a matter of grave importance regarding executive conduct and the misuse of company assets. But before we delve into the specifics, there is a foundational matter of governance that must be clarified." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. "As you know, upon his retirement, our founder, Arthur Vance, placed his majority ownership stake, 51% of this company, into a private family trust. The management of that trust is my responsibility. However, the trust has a sole designated beneficiary and representative. That individual has, until now, chosen to remain a silent partner, allowing the board and the executive team to manage operations without interference. A low murmur went through the room. Greg stared at David, his brow furrowed in confusion, not yet comprehending where this was going. David gestured toward me. Members of the board, allow me to formally introduce you to the beneficial owner of 51% of Innovate Logistics, the woman you have known as Greg's wife, Linda Vance. The silence was absolute. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Jaws literally dropped. The board members swiveled their heads to stare at me, their expressions a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning understanding. Greg's face was a mask of utter devastation. The color drained from his skin, leaving him a ghastly shade of gray. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost, or perhaps a monster he had never known was living in his own house. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him in a single, brutal wave. He finally choked out, his voice a hoarse whisper. That's not possible. It is not only possible, it is a legal and financial fact, David said coolly, before turning his attention to me. Linda, would you like to address the board? I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate. I didn't look at the portfolio of evidence. I didn't need to. I looked directly at Greg, my voice clear and steady, carrying easily across the silent room. For 10 years, I began, I have quietly supported this company and its employees from behind the scenes. I believed in its mission because I believed in the integrity of its founder, my father. I kept my ownership silent because I wanted a life and a marriage based on mutual respect, not on financial power. I let my gaze sweep across the faces of the board members before landing back on my husband. Greg recently informed me that he was leaving me because my life was too small and predictable. He was seeking something more vibrant. It seems that pursuit of vibrancy came at a significant cost to Innovate Logistics. At that, David stepped forward and began distributing copies of the portfolio to each board member. Before you will find detailed evidence of Mr. Peterson's corporate credit card abuse, unauthorized travel expenses for a non-employee, and the fraudulent allocation of a $20,000 bonus to a subordinate, Ms. Tiffany Miller, with whom he was engaged in an inappropriate relationship. In total, he has defrauded this company of over $70,000 in the last year alone. The board members began flipping through the pages, their expressions hardening with each receipt and statement they reviewed. The case was undeniable. Greg finally found his voice, a pathetic, desperate rasp. This is a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation of expenses. This is a private matter being twisted. It was then that the final, triumphant moment occurred. It came not from me, but from Frank Morrison. He looked up from the portfolio, his face a mask of profound disappointment, and he looked Greg straight in the eye. Greg, he said, his voice heavy with finality. Innovate Logistics has a zero-tolerance policy for fraud. As acting CEO, and with the full backing of the majority shareholder, I am asking for your immediate resignation. Resignation, Greg sputtered, his eyes wide with panic. I won't resign. Very well, Frank said, his tone turning to ice. Then let's put it to a vote. All in favor of terminating the employment of Greg Peterson, for cause, effective immediately. Every single hand around the table went up, mine included. It was over. In the space of 10 minutes, Greg's entire world had been obliterated. He was publicly humiliated, professionally destroyed, and utterly broken. He stared at me, his eyes pleading, searching for an answer to a question he couldn't even form. He had looked at me and seen a simple garden. He had finally been forced to see the forest. The aftermath of the board meeting was swift and decisive. Greg was escorted from the building by security, not as a senior vice president, but as a disgraced ex-employee. He left with nothing but the clothes on his back and the crushing weight of his own arrogance. His corporate accounts were permanently sealed, and a formal letter of termination, citing gross misconduct and embezzlement, was sent to his new address, Tiffany's downtown apartment. Tiffany Miller was fired that same afternoon. When presented with the evidence of her complicity in defrauding the company, she offered no resistance, reportedly bursting into tears and accepting her fate. The vibrant and exciting future she had envisioned with a powerful executive had evaporated overnight. She was left with an unemployed, disgraced man and a tarnished reputation that would follow her in the industry. The divorce proceedings were remarkably simple. David's legal team handled everything with cold efficiency. The ironclad trust my father had established meant that my 51% ownership of Innovate Logistics was classified as a separate, inherited asset. It was untouchable. Greg had no claim to it, not a single share, not a single dollar. His lawyer, after reviewing the documents, advised him not to even try fighting it. In the end, he walked away with only half of our joint savings account and his personal belongings, which I had already shipped to his new, downsized life. A week after the board meeting, I sat with my father in the garden, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance filling the air. It felt like the first deep, clean breath I had taken in years. "I heard from Frank this morning," Arthur said, swirling the ice in his glass of tea. "The board has formally offered you a permanent seat, not as a silent partner, but as vice chair." I looked at him, a small smile playing on my lips. "And what do you think about that?" "I think," he said, his eyes twinkling, "it's about damn time. Your mother would have been so proud, Linda. She was always the true strategist in the family." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the bees buzz among the lavender. The pain of Greg's betrayal had not vanished entirely, but it no longer had power over me. It had been transformed into something else, a catalyst. It had forced me to reclaim a part of myself I had allowed to lie dormant for far too long. Greg's final, insulting words echoed in my mind, a small, predictable life. He had no idea how wrong he was. My life wasn't small, it was focused. It wasn't predictable, it was stable. It was the launching pad he had used and then tried to destroy on his way out. The next Monday, I drove to the Innovate Logistics Tower. This time, I didn't stop at a temporary office. I took the elevator straight to the top floor. I walked into the executive boardroom, the same room where Greg's career had imploded, and took my seat at the table. It was no longer a place of confrontation, but a place of purpose. I had found my vibrancy. It wasn't in reckless affairs or lavish, stolen weekends. It was in my own strength, in the quiet confidence of knowing my own worth. It was in protecting my family's legacy and stepping into the power that had always been mine. From the boardroom window, the city sprawled out before me, a landscape of endless possibility. My future was anything but predictable, and for the first time in a long time, I was the one holding the map.